In this video, we're going to introduce you to a new theorem called the congruent supplements theorem. Now, even though the name of that is new, you could probably figure out this theorem all on your own. Here's what this theorem says. It says we're going to look at two different pairs of angles. And if we look at two different pairs of angles, and we know that the red angles, 1 and 2, are congruent to each other, it really wants to know, can you figure out, or can you make a determination about the supplements of these angles? So can we make a determination about the relationship between the blue angles in each picture? And you're probably looking at that, or at least I hope you're looking at that, saying, well, if angles 1 and 2 are congruent to each other, then the blue angles have to be congruent to each other as well, because they have to be the supplements of angles 1 and 2. They both have to lie on the same straight line, meaning their sum, or their total, has to be equal to 180 degrees. And that's what the congruent supplements theorem says. So the congruent supplements theorem really says that when two angles are congruent, their supplements are also congruent. Or you might say congruent angles have congruent supplements. And of course we can use this fact in our proof writing, so let's go see how we might use this in a proof. In the first example, we're given that segment AP is congruent to segment CP, so the first thing that I'm going to do is go mark those. We're given that angle X is congruent to angle Y. Well, if angle X is congruent to angle Y, I know that the supplement to angle X has to be congruent to the supplement of angle Y. And the supplement to angle X lies inside the triangle, like the supplement of angle Y lies inside the triangle. So now I have angle 1 and angle 2 congruent because they're supplements of the congruent angles X and Y. The last piece of information that they give us in the given is that points B, P, and D all lie on the same straight line. Well, that's kind of like a thanks for nothing, because we can tell from the picture that those 3 points all lie on the same straight line. Now that said, if our mission is to prove that these two triangles are congruent, we know that we either have to go side, 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 angle, side, angle, side, angle, 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 side, or HL. We're going to fall back on those 5 trusty friends. And in looking at the diagram, I have a pair of congruent sides in AP and CP. I have a pair of congruent angles in 1 and in angle 2. And I have a shared pair of sides up the middle with BP congruent to itself via the reflexive property. So my strategy that I'm going to use here to prove that these two guys are congruent to each other is going to be side, angle, side. And in my proof, again, I want to talk about the first pair of sides, maybe BP being congruent to itself. So again, I'm outlining my strategy here. My congruent angles are 1 and 2. And my second pair of congruent sides, AP and CP. And I think I'll do statement reason proof for my first proof here. So my first pair of congruent sides that I wanted to write about, BP congruent to itself. And I know those two sides are congruent by the reflexive property. And since that's a pair of sides in the triangles I'm trying to prove congruent, I'm going to mark that with an S. My next pair of congruent parts that I wanted to discuss is the fact that angles 1 are congruent. Angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Now I know those two are congruent because they're the supplements of angle X and angle Y. So before I can talk about those two angles being congruent in my proof, I need to have a little discussion of everything that went on with angle X and angle Y. So I'm going to go ahead now and use that second given, the fact that angle X is congruent to angle Y. I know that's a true statement because it's given to us to be a true statement. I also need to have a discussion of the fact that angle 1 is supplementary to angle X and that angle 2 is supplementary to angle Y. So I think that's what I'm going to discuss next. Angle X is supplementary to angle 1. Angle Y is supplementary to angle 2. I know that's a true statement because if I look at the diagram, angle X and angle 1 form a linear pair. Angle Y and angle 2 form a linear pair. So I'm just going to say linear pairs, and that's going to be a word that you're going to want to commit to your memory. Linear pairs are supplementary. So now in statement 2, I've got these congruent angles. In statement 3, I've got their supplements. I know that anytime two angles are congruent, their supplements have to be congruent as well. So angle 1 has to be congruent to angle 2, and I can either say congruent supplements theorem, I can say when two angles are congruent, their supplements are congruent, or I can just say congruent angles have congruent supplements. And I'm going to cite statements 3 and 4, because statement 3 was where I had the congruent angles. Statements 2 and 3. Statement 2 was where I had the congruent angles, and statement 3 was where I had the supplementary angles. And because that's a pair of congruent angles, I'm going to mark that with an A. My second pair of congruent sides, AP and CP, was given to me. And so now I've proven those triangles congruent by side angle side. My first pair of sides was in statement 1. My pair of angles was in statement 4. And lastly, my second pair of congruent sides was in statement 5. Number 2, I'm going to leave for you to do because this is actually review using the angle subtraction theorem. So there's a little bit of hint here that you're going to have to do some angle subtraction theorem on this question. And where I actually want to go is to the next page on the apply what you've learned question. So I'm going to skip down to number 2 on page 26. And because this uses the new material, I would prefer to do this proof right along with you. So it says angle CBE is congruent to angle DBE. And because I know those green angles are congruent, I also know their supplements have to be congruent to each other. So I now know that angles 1 and 2 inside the triangle are congruent to each other. I know that segment ABE bisects angle CAD. So CAD is that red one. An angle bisector I know is going to split an angle into two congruent parts. So I now know that angles 3 and 4 are congruent. And the reflexive property tells me that side AB is going to be congruent to side AB. So in trying to prove these two triangles congruent, I'm seeing an angle, side, angle. With my first pair of angles being angle 3 congruent to angle 4, my pair of sides being AB congruent to itself, and my second pair of congruent angles being angle 1 congruent to angle 2. All right, so the first pair of congruent angles I want to write about are angles 3 and 4 being congruent. I knew they were congruent because of the whole angle bisector. So I'm going to start my proof out by discussing that angle bisector. I know that's a true statement because it's given to us to be a true statement. And because of that angle bisector, I know that angles 3 and 4 are congruent. So that first pair of angles, done. I now want to use reflexive property to talk about side AB being congruent to side AB. That's pretty straightforward. So there's our pair of congruent sides. So I've got side AB congruent to side AB by the reflexive property. Done. And then lastly, I have to establish the fact that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. And this is going to be a little bit more difficult, and then I'm going to have to use the congruent supplements theorem. So I knew that those two angles were congruent because of this first given. So I'm going to start out by talking about angle CBE being congruent to angle DBE. I know that's a true statement because it's given to me. And now I'm going to have to talk about these pairs of supplementary angles. So angle 1 is supplementary to angle CBE. Angle 2 and angle 2 is going to be supplementary to angle DBE. And the reason for that is if I look at the picture, I have those linear pairs. Linear pairs are supplementary. So now I can pull these two guys together and go ahead and conclude that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. And that's either the congruent supplements theorem, or you can say congruent angles have congruent supplements, or when two angles are congruent, their supplements are also congruent. And so now I have all three of these pieces that I need in order to make the triangles congruent. So triangle ACB has to be congruent to triangle ADB. My reason for that was angle side angle. As always, I'm going to have you summarize the key ideas and important understandings from this video at the top of the page. And I think we will call it a day on that one. So if you can summarize key ideas and important understandings for the next time that you come back to class, I'll be a happy camper.